Hi, Nigel. I am so glad you're on my podcast today for Hot Topic Bold Talk. I want to say to my listeners that Nigel Lakey is a very talented man. He has owned businesses, he's worked in many corporations. The reason I have him on today, though, is he and I thoroughly enjoy talking to each other, even though we have different points of view. And I think that's something we need. So I'm delighted to have you here today. But also, listeners, I'm going to give you a lot more about Nigel in my closing comments to this podcast. So, hi, Nigel. It's your turn to speak a little bit. How about that?
Jackalyn, outstanding. Very much appreciate the opportunity. And just to build a little on a comment there, right? We talk about a lot of things. Interestingly enough, there's always something interesting to talk about. Doesn't have to be controversial, doesn't have to be disagreeable, but you can imagine you get a couple of people, you sit down over lunch and you have a conversation. I think that's a great way to spend an hour or so. And I hope we do the same thing here today. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for the
Thank,
invitation.
thank you. And I really do feel blessed all the times we go to lunch. And listeners, I want to tell you, sometimes I call Nigel and say, we have to have lunch because I've been thinking about a bunch of things and I need your help to straighten my ideas out so that I can talk about them on my podcast. So, anyway, those are some of the comments I would have. Nigel, I think one of the things that I'd like to begin with, though, is I know you're a conservative. I'd like for you to define what conservative means to you, since you know I'm more liberal.
Yes. So where do we start? Let me have a crack at that. I'm going to step back a little bit and say uh, conservatism, it almost depends on the passport that you carry. And I carry three passports, all of which are tremendously important to me because they're, first off, my legacy, if you will. That's my past. I feel strong ties to both Canada and Britain. I'm the one of three sons of immigrant parents who immigrated to Canada after World War II. So I carry a British passport. I'm somewhat in memory of that. My mother passed away some time ago. My father, he's about to turn 98 and he's still doing very well.
Wow.
Of course, born and raised in Canada, so carry a Canadian passport. And I relocated from Calgary in Western Canada to Houston in 2000. Yeah, so 25 years ago now. I'm a naturalized US citizen and I carry that passport with pride. And that's how I principally identify myself. If I travel, that is my chosen passport. I carry the Canadian one because it makes it easier to get back into Canada, the British one, likewise, to get back into the UK. But when I say it depends on the passport that you carry, I think the nature of politics, both uppercase P and lowercase p politics, changes materially in any one of those three places. So I have the genes, if you will, from my parents who were likewise conservative. I've got my upbringing, my education in Western Canada, and the first 20 years or so of my career there. And then I've got the conservatism, if you will, that I've turned to as a result of being a US citizen. But I would say there's one thing, maybe three things that are at the top of this all over. And in no real order, but I would say first is government reach and the size of government. So when I think of being a conservative, I think any one of those three passports. I like to say that it reflects having a smaller government that doesn't reach too deep into the lives of its citizenry. The second one, and certainly in light of recent events, trade and commerce. I think conservatism, to me, says it's a free market economy. The government shouldn't be picking winners or losers. And a well-educated, well-developed citizenry will drive a market. They will decide the things that they want. And I think that historically, society hasn't been too bad at doing that. And last, and this may be the most important, is the individual rights and freedoms that you enjoy. And to me, this is where government size and reach starts to have a significant impact on the rights and freedoms that you enjoy, or, for example, may not. And I'll draw a contrast here across those three passports and say that of those three, my US passport is the only one that's backed by truly a Bill of Rights and a Constitution. And the Bill of Rights and the Constitution help us to define this thing that we call the Republic. You could say it's a republic of independent states, and the states have a fair bit to say about how they manage their own citizens. I admire that. I think the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they're durable, they're sensible. I would say that I'm probably an originalist when it comes to the Constitution, and that does indeed brand me as a conservative. The counter to that is both Canada and Britain, where there isn't a constitution. These are true democracies, if you will, where it's the common vote that decides everything. And I think the unique aspect of the US is where the common vote doesn't necessarily drive it. If that were the case, then our country would be governed by people in California and, say, New York, where you have the largest voting populace. But we enjoy the protection of that republic and its constitution. And, I'm proud to carry the passport. The other aspects, I think, when I say, in response to how do you look at conservatism, I think there's things, a strong national identity. And that to me is, I'm a federalist and not a globalist. I'll be very careful with my choice of words because it's not about chanting America first sort of thing. But I will say that America needs to look after itself. And I don't know that it matters which political side you're on. We probably all would agree on that. When I think of other aspects, it's the accountability of individual for their behavior, for their actions, the responsibility that they have. They enjoy the protection of a military, they enjoy the protection of a banking system and all that sort of thing in this country. And you've got a responsibility, I would say, to manage your own affairs. And I'll make a comment here. Years ago, my mother gave me one piece of advice, and basically it's don't get arrested, because that would be the most embarrassing thing that she could imagine. Now, look, I've never been arrested. I actually been persona non grata out of Libya, but it had nothing to do with behaviors. I didn't violate any laws there. It was just showing up without a visa in your passport. They took somewhat of a dim view of that. I did get a visa, but they drove me to the airport, made sure I got on the flight. But it was really what I think, again, of the individual responsibilities, the accountability for your own behavior. And it's, the government protects us, not so much provides for us. So, these are some of the cornerstones. I think there's other bits in there too. My background is one of not a hard Christian upbringing, but I was brought up in what I would say is a Christian household. So I've got in my pocket these Judeo-Christian values. And I think those are really important, right? I live my life by those. I do my best to do that. And that's responsibility, accountability. It's putting the effort out, that sort of thing. You could say it's a bit of the golden rule, which is you treat others like you want to be treated yourself. So I think that these are important aspects. And oddly enough, I'm not sure that there's a lot of difference on either side of the spectrum. But again, when I think of conservatism, I'm looking for a strong country. I support that. I support actions that reflect that. The security of the borders, law and order, where there's defined laws and people follow them. So I'm not speaking about others. I'm just saying this is me. When I think of that, we've got a constitution. It defines the role of government. It defines the responsibilities of its citizenry. I like that construct. I like that much more than a Bill of Rights that doesn't really even allow me to own property, for example. So the conservative aspect for me very much is rooted in the Constitution of the US. And I think it's free market, limited government, individual responsibility. Those are the things. If I said conservatism, what does it mean? That's the stuff that I would bring up.
Thank you. And it's very thorough. And I think one of the things that I would say is I'm very liberal, and I have stood for social justice, and I've stood for diversity for many years. Those are some of my high order values. But I think what I would say about us when we talk is I really do believe that people need to follow the law and appreciate the Constitution of the United States, like you talked about. It's there for us to prevent corruption and a lot of things that I think are happening right now. So I truly believe in the Constitution. I believe in our democracy, and I'm appreciative of the Republic. And so you're not the first conservative I've talked to that I know that I can sit and have discussions with you. Now, being the liberal person I am, I may have more government involved because I think that sometimes the rights of human beings lead us to having people who are less than, and sometimes they need help from the government. So I may be in that situation where I believe people need assistance at very times. Doesn't mean I'm going to have a massive government. I think government reform is helpful. And I truthfully think that one of the things that the Democratic Party did not look at in this last election was we do need some reform in our government periodically. But I'm one that really believes that government can serve us and support us as human beings. So there's a slight change, where we are.
Mhm.
But I think one of the things that also struck me about what you said, my father was financially conservative. He was very strong in his financial conservatism, but he believed in social rights and social advancement. And he knew that he had the chance to meet his dreams in his life by all the things he did in business because he had those opportunities and nobody discriminated against him in being able to obtain those opportunities. So I think in some ways, what you and I are talking about has a lot of similarity. And since you mentioned family, and I'll be happy to hear anything you have to say about what I'm saying, but I grew up in a household where my father was financially conservative, but he was very socially liberal. He was very supportive of all human beings, and many different types of people worked for him. The other thing, though, that happened to me was I asked my mother at 5 years old, because I became very conscious of the racism in America, because I grew up in the 40s and 50s. And she just said to me, that is true. It does exist in our town. But she said, we don't treat people that way when they come into our home. And so she was very clear about that. So she didn't call the person who came in and helped to clean the house and keep it nice. She called her a house manager rather than a maid. And she saw that as very important. Something happened to me, Nigel, though I think that was a major factor. My parents got very ill when I was 9. And for about 2 years there, we had a woman who was an LVN that took care of them, but also took me to school. And something happened in the fact that she would take me to the movies on Saturdays, and we would ride the bus. And I thought it was cool, that we were riding the bus. And I never had any trouble with it. We got out of the movies one day and we got on the bus, and the person who was driving said that I had to sit at the front because I was not African American. And I was 9 and I didn't want to go up there. I wanted to stay with Nettie, who was sitting in the back. And the driver said he wouldn't drive the bus if I didn't get up to the front. So I moved up. And so Nettie made a decision and she pulled the string and we walked 18 blocks home. And she made it an amazing experience. But I know she was tired because I was sure as heck tired, 18 blocks. And when I got home, I told my mother what happened. And all of a sudden, the next day, mother had a new car, but Nettie had mother's 1-year-old car, and they gave her the car and said, you have been a tremendous help to us for these 2 years. And we don't want you to ever have that kind of experience again. So I grew up in a household where it was very clear that I needed to appreciate people, no matter who they were, and to try to understand what happened to them. And as a child, I said to mom, when I told this story, I said, Nettie's really tired because she had to carry me some. And so, of course, my mom said, do you want to go home? She said, I'm just fine. And so the next day, though, my parents made a decision that they didn't want that kind of discrimination to happen again. So I know you, Nigel, and I think it would be helpful for you as a conservative to talk about your view of civil rights, or rights in America, because I think we have some commonality there.
Well, absolutely. So I'll throw back to the three passports again and say, of those three, you've got one society in the form of Britain that you could argue has been around for well over 1,000 years. And one could argue our current political systems are founded on their beliefs, et cetera, right? But also that there's a history of repression and slavery. And the British history is grandiose and it's large, but it's not that pretty. Canada, amongst the three passports that I have, being the youngest, and I'm going to say potentially less socially developed. And I know that sounds critical, but it's more about, I think, that country is still trying to figure out what it is. Mm-hmm. And I say that with love, again, not with criticism. You got the U.S. that was born as a result of their dissatisfaction with Britain and the majesty of Britain, taxation without representation. We're all familiar with that. So none of them has got a particularly pretty history, but of them, which has recognized it, which has taken steps to correct it. And again, none of them is perfect, but when I look at the U.S., I'll say this, right? I came to Texas my first trip long before I was in this business. But when I moved here, what had become clear to me from the number of trips that I've made here, that I had an uncle who lived just outside of Houston, is if you showed up in Houston and you put in the effort, you were treated with respect. And I think that was irrespective of your skin color, your heritage, whatever. So as much as people might want to say, Texas is kind of the Wild West redneck, I think that in fact it's a very sophisticated place. And there's a great deal of respect from people from all walks of life, all stations in life. Unforgettably and undeniably, though, there are idiots amongst us, and their views aren't the same as mine. And I will also say my views are not the same as them. When I look at civil rights, when I think of the U.S. and its Bill of Rights and the guarantee, if you will, of life, liberty, and happiness, nowhere in there does it make mention of where you're from. In fact, we talk specifically that your nationality, your heritage, etc., have no bearing in the rights that you have under the Constitution. So I know, but to better answer your question, the civil rights movement in the U.S. was cataclysmic for this country. It demanded, suffrage for women voters. It demanded that you didn't have to sit at the back or the front of the bus. It demanded that banks, every entity, had to treat you fairly. We're not all the way there yet, but it's a country, when I look at it and say, for civil rights, by and large, we're doing not that bad. And this is in contrast, certainly, to many of the countries that I visited, and there are many, in many cultures that I've experienced. I think this country treats its citizens pretty well. Can we do better? Yes, we can do better. But I will say, take a trip to places in North Africa or the Middle East or, former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. Things are a lot different there. So we're doing all right. And the thing that I think is more significant is this country is reasonably self-aware. And it shows a maturity, if you will, one that the country has survived for, it'd be 250 years next year, of course. And by and large, that Constitution has stood the test of time. There's a pile of amendments to it. But when I say self-aware, I think that we also manage ourselves while we're aware of our failings. I do think that often we show great promise that we can manage ourselves better. I think maybe a distinction that I would draw is I've got a personal responsibility to treat people and a moral
Right,
responsibility to treat people and a social responsibility, right? That's the golden rule concept. I would like to believe that I don't need the government to tell me how to do that. Now, um, you mentioned maybe slightly larger government, slightly smaller government. My opinion is there that it's not so much the size of the government, but how much they're spending and what they're doing, and what do we as citizens get for it, right? So
right.
if it furthers the interests of the nation, and if that demanded a slightly larger government or whatever, then I think I got to look at that logically and say you can't just draw a line and say that's too big for government. But tell me what they're doing. Tell me what we're getting from it as a result. So,
Right.
uh, but when you're on the civil rights and personal responsibility, that's an interesting trajectory, right? Because if we as individuals don't believe that we have a responsibility, then I don't know that we get past really get out of the gate with social justice, if you will. And it's kind of from my perspective, when I think of diversity, I think that my own experience says I've done well as a consequence of doing diversity hires. And that's not just gender, that's experience. And I've worked around the world. I've been at a bunch of places and hired a bunch of people, fired a bunch of people too, unfortunately. But the diversity has done well for me and done well for the company. And the company's done well because of the diversity. So, uh, how do we get the diversity? And we could kind of put that on the table as an object. Can we do it without having the legislation? Can we do it without extensive overreach that kind of makes us carry a scorecard around? Uh, but can we do better on individual rights and freedoms and keep civil rights, social justice in our sights? Yeah. Now, it's interesting because guess what? We kind of both really much believe in it. And it's more a matter of what's the method we're going to employ to get there. But when I think of conservatism, once again, it doesn't really define me politically. Some would say that it does. I think it defines me more as a human being. And if somebody said, "Well, I know that guy, and I know his reputation, and I know his character," well, I think that's what conservative defines for me. It's more of what you could expect of me, probably less about my behavior in a political theater.
Thank you. And one of the things I was struck about what you were saying was I think that the one thing that I've spent my life doing is I have been an activist all my life. I started at 5 when I started asking my mother that question. And I did march in the civil rights movement because I'm old enough to have been there because it was in the 60s and I was in college. So I marched. I didn't march a number of times. I marched 3 or 4 times. And when my mother told me she wouldn't send me back to the University of Texas if I didn't start marching because she was worried about what was happening to me. But I think what I know is I've spent my life looking at 9 different areas that I've written papers for, which you know about, for Private Directors Association, because I talk about the very areas that I do think we need to look at in order to understand how we can treat people. So my thing is, I think we need to have a history and experience about different individuals. I It can be about race, it can be about gender, it can be about uh, sexual orientation. It can be about the way that we perceive business, so that we have a different diversity, because we can't function in a rural community if we don't have different points of view and different experiences. So I think what brings us together is we both know, and you emphasize it with being responsible yourself and being respectful to other human beings. And I have more of a view that what I'm seeing right now in this current political situation is a rejection of civil rights for many people, a judgment about how diversity is going, how diversity has been carried out and the benefits of it. And I think there is a much smaller group that would say today that they support what's happening here right now. And I don't think I'm wrong, because I'm watching a lot of people say how remorseful they are that they voted in a certain way. I think for me, it's being able to understand the history and the experiences of individuals and how they are different, and how that difference can truly build in our organizations a meaningful way that we can really appreciate each other. Therefore, we will be socially just. I don't believe in corruption. I believe in the law and the order and so forth. And I see corruption happening now. Personal interest being more important, or getting out of things about responsibility. So I think the reason we are friends is because I think people are accountable and responsible, just like you said. And I don't see that happening. Now, it doesn't mean everybody in this country, because I know there's some views about, specifically about abortion, that 72% of America think there ought to be rights for abortion for women, and not have women dying because of that situation. So I think America is very confusing, because when you take specific subject matters like we discussed, then we have lots of different points of view. But I'm going to put you on the spot for a moment, because I think that your conservative points of view would not support some of the things that are going on right now in Washington. And I don't know whether you want to address it, or you want me to just go on and we'll talk about our values and so forth. But I do not support what is happening at the current moment in Washington, D.C., with some of the actions they're taking. I don't think we have to harm people to reform government. And I don't have to, I do believe in a secure border. But I think there is one of the things that came out in my podcast yesterday. There's a woman that is a representative from what she says a purple district. And she said, I believe in law and order. And I believe that we also can have a way of opening up our borders to benefit from people like you and a lot of other people that come in that have contributed so much to America. And I think there's another way of doing what we need to do about inviting people into our country and making decisions about how to do that and still protect our borders. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say, Nigel.
Absolutely. We talk about law, we talk about corruption, we talk about this. I think, once again, when I say conservative, you need to be careful how we brand people, because there's conservative, and then there's, I don't know, call it a spectrum, if you will. You can be somewhere, whatever the case may be. And frankly, I know people who would classify themselves as liberal, but they vote Republican. Now, I'm not going to get into who and why and that sort of thing, but what any one of us is seeing at any time, I think, is this tableau of activities and behavior that we don't find acceptable, right? So I would say, in a previous administration, I thought that their behavior was reprehensible, and I thought that you have factions of government that is overreaching and extending way beyond the constitutional powers that we as citizens give our government, right? It's not the popular vote that elects government in the United States, given our structure, right? So I think we have to be careful. Do I like everything that's going on? No. Did I like anything that was going on earlier? No. And I think that government was in need of reform. Now, it can be a different conversation about how you get that reform underway and how you do it. But I think what we're seeing increasingly in this country is just this absolute polarization. And I don't know if this is how you appeal to voters on either side or right down the middle. I can't judge that because I hear it, but I tend to not listen to it, right? It really annoys me, and it feels like I've wasted time when I fall into that philosophical, ideological debate. I think that this country has a great future, and I don't think a single government administration can ruin it. I think it's robust enough. But what I'm worried about is we'll go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. We'll tire ourselves out. We'll tire out the rest of the world. I don't know what it has to look like, right? Can we reform our own behavior? And I think there's one risk here that we have to be very careful. We can't deny it. And that's that we fall into this trap of being a welfare state because we expect the government to fix everything. And frankly, this is where we find Canada and the UK and in a lot of instances, Western Europe, right? I say this not to offend anybody, but it's just a personal belief. I think that ESG scores, for example, are a complete waste of time. They serve no interest. They don't serve the interest of the shareholder, society, et cetera. The energy transition that we talk of, and Germany shutting down coal plants and nuclear plants, and now here's a country that could barely look after its own citizenry, right? The flattening of the world, if you will, the globalism, where technology disappears. We're no longer artisans we used to be, and some countries could say the same thing. And this is where I start to really have strong disagreement with just letting people pour into the country, right? I mean, I did it the right way, and I know lots of other people have. I know lots of other people have gone to other countries, right, and become citizens. But the interesting thing is, the U.S. is almost unique. In fact, I think it is that you can show up in the U.S., become a citizen, and then you are American, right? I can't do that in France. I couldn't go live in France and be assured of having a passport and then being seen as a citizen, right? It's interesting. Now, think about the value of immigration. It's tremendously important, and this country is an absolute population of immigrants. I mean, I'm one of them.
Right.
Who can possibly sit here and tell us that they're native North American? There are indigenous peoples, right? That's undeniable. But the bulk of the population in the Western world came from some other place. And I support that, right? And I think that these people bring great ideas. They bring capital, they bring opportunity, they bring intellect, they bring culture. And we need to find a way to do that and do it correctly. And I think when it comes to trade, when it comes to immigration, the balance or the reform that we should be trying to get our heads around is what's right, what's the future state that we're trying to do here. And to me, this really transcends the political side of it, right? If we don't know what we're supposed to be when we grow up, and this really annoys me because the government polarization, administration to administration, that whipsaw, it deconstructs anything good that happened prior to, sets the stage for deconstruction subsequent to it. And I don't know that we ever make any advances. So how do we get back to the point where we're actually advancing in society and being the shining city on the hill? And I can't remember who said that, but there's so much that we can do. When do we know that we've reformed? Another political cycle like we just went through is not going to be helpful. Now, you could say some people have remorse. I mean, I look at it and say, either way that one would have voted, you'd be disappointed in some of the behavior. Now, I try to keep in mind, or what I'm hoping I'm keeping in mind, is what's the greater good here? Will we can we accomplish these goals of, to use your word, social justice by just improving our own society, by not so much being insular, not so much by closing borders, but instead of just, let's build the social network that we have.
Right.
Let's get an education system that actually delivers educated people, not indoctrinated people. And I feel very, very strongly about that. Either way that you
Thank
may want to
you.
indoctrinate, but um, we're not necessarily building the best and the brightest any longer as we grow the population. So immigration's got a place to bring the intellect in, because smart people live all over the place, right? And we need the smartest of the smart. And we need the people who come here and will work within the construct of our society. And I think
Right.
that's a little difficult sometimes to describe. What does it mean to be an American? I would say 20 years ago, I could define that. The first 4 or 5 years that I was here, I felt comfortable describing to people what it meant to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit more troubled by now. And I would say when people around the world look into us as Americans, they would say, I don't understand those cats any longer. I don't know. Now,
Well, and I think, and Nigel, one of the things I was going to say is I don't think people understand us anymore because of all the actions that are being taken. And I think I think the reason you and I talk to each other, even though we have different points of view, is we have a commitment that we're going to listen. And so I think some people will find this podcast interesting because I've sat very quietly and listened to you and then made comments. And you've done the same thing with me. We have no investment in staying in polarized positions. We're sitting down and trying to think about. And so what I know is you and I are going to have other conversations, and they'll probably be on my podcast periodically. Because I think people need to understand that even though you want less government and I want some more government to serve the people and so forth, I don't believe in a welfare state. I believe in finding ways that we can support people in a very constructive way so they can achieve what they really want to do. And there is one thing that I know. There are many undocumented immigrants in this country that if we had given them an easier chance after being here 20 years or 15 years or whatever to become citizens, they're already paying taxes. I know that. And yet, right now, they're in danger for what's happening. So that's probably one of be our future topics. But I think both of us want some resolution, and we can't do it without listening and then talking with each other and see if we can come up with something better. And that has not been happening. I think it's hard, and I'll admit this. I've done a lot of programs around diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think if you take the three words and separate them out and don't use the label to be angry about, then you can see that there's a real opportunity. How do we include people in America that would like to come here for a better life? How do we do that? Or how do we establish even more what we can do as far as how we can construct a government that meets our needs, but is not so expansive that it costs a tremendous amount of money to run. So I'm probably sounding more like you. And yet, I think that, you know, I'm glad to have the ability to talk with you because I've tried to talk with, I don't know what I would call them, Republicans. I would call you a Republican, but the ones that I see, a mass of them, I see them as an extreme polarized position of what we've had in the past in our country as far as the Republican Party is concerned. And it's hard to talk with those individuals
you
because
know,
I get labeled and I get lots of argument. I don't argue with you, and I'll tell you the reason I don't. Because I value who you are, and I'm going to listen to you because I know you are very thoughtful and careful in the way you formulate ideas so that they can be respectfully presented. So I would like, I think, to go in and talk about how our values have really established and helped to establish our friendship. So tell me what your values are, and then I'll talk about it because I think we've never had much of a chance to do that. And I think that I have 5 values that are very important, but I think they fit and they do not collide. They fit with the values you have.
I would look at, how do values manifest themselves, right? Typically in behavior, the reputation that you carry, and just brief reflect on a comment that you made. I mean, we've got around the world, we have people who live in such fringe environments ideologically, and they're either end of the spectrum, right? And those people aren't helping any of us do anything. And I think what scares me is if they're the only ones that are voting because others have just said, my God, there's nothing I can do to fix this, right? Then man, we're in trouble. But how do we reform society? Now, I'm going to say that this is a segue into the values question here. When I think of what's important to me, I would look at my behavior, my interaction, and my expectations of other people, right? And I expect respect. And you and I talk, and I like to be able to talk to people and not raise it to an argument where you're just bickering back and forth. I think a piece of that comes from just say, guess what? We're old. We fought a lot of wars, a lot of battles, and the collateral damage is not worth it, right? So there's nothing to be gained by raising your voice, yelling. I think the elegance is having a conversation, try and understand. And you can reflect on 7 habits and any number of old saws, if you will, right? You don't seek first to understand, then be understood, that kind of thing. But I think when it gets to values, it's a principle one, which is integrity. That's how do people think of you when somebody mentions your name in a conversation? How does the other party respond? What's the emotion that goes through their head? And I know that there's people that when somebody mentions their name, I go, my God, I don't want to even talk about that person, right? That individual has in some manner disappointed me or angered me so much. And yeah, maybe that's a failing on my part, right? Because I haven't made the effort to truly understand. But I want to make sure that I don't galvanize people that way. So I'm going to say that's authenticity, right? The integrity aspect and then the authenticity, which is, well, that's what you see all the time. And I don't want to say that thing like what you see is what you get, because that sounds like that's a person who has no soul, who's got no color, no opinions, yada, yada, or they're so boring. I think it kind of manifests itself in consistency, right? The ability to communicate is a value to me as well. And it's how can you actually convey an idea to somebody? How can you engage in a conversation, right? Call that being rational. I'm going to say another one is critical thinking, which if you can't begin to understand somebody else's viewpoint, or at least, ingest it, dissect it, think about it, balance it, then you're probably not going to learn anything. Another value I think would want to try to manage your intellect, keep your intellect above your ego, not your ego above your intellect. Grow your intellect, don't necessarily grow your ego. Now, I don't know, again, if those are values or behaviors or traits or characteristics, but when I think about it, I want to talk with somebody when the encounter is over. The person says, I have some things I need to think about. I've got to go talk to somebody else about this. But the person doesn't say, I just wasted an hour of my life that I'll never get back. And we've all had those experiences, right? Whether it's watching a movie, a TV show, or something where you're thinking, was there ever a story behind this? Is this plausible in any way? And then when you listen to people in industry, can you trust them? Can you believe them?
Well, Nigel, I think there's several things. You talk about integrity, and I talk about honesty. Because if I have integrity, I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to take responsibility for what I do, and I'm not going to blame everybody else in the world. I'm going to look at myself, and then I'm going to try to talk to the other person and see if we can resolve whatever conflict we have. But I don't believe in being irresponsible and blaming other people. I believe in being responsible and talking about it and owning what is my part so that other people will do that. And I think that's what you do. And I think it's part of your authenticity. I think another thing is that you talked about earlier about growing up as a Christian. So did I. My mother was a Bible scholar, but she at 5 or 6 or whatever, she would tell me these stories from the Bible. So I thought the Bible was this wonderful storybook. I had to learn later on that it was many other things to it. But I think another thing that is a part of my authenticity is I truly believe in spirituality. I don't think there's a day that I don't know that what I call my higher power, which happens to be God for me, directs my life. And I try to stay in the present moment so that I can live every day to the fullest. And I think that's what your authenticity is. Another thing is I think in all your history and the things I know about you, you've been a risk taker all of your life. That's one of the things I do, because I have confronted many organizations that have been very inappropriate in the way they've dealt with people, and asked them to look at these individuals and see what the problems were, and let's see if we can resolve them, because you've already spent a lot of money on training them. So why don't we see whether we can truly build something that's useful and understand what is the problem? What is the thing that we can do that will help these individuals feel included or whatever else? Another thing too is I know something about you. You and I both have been members of boards, and whether they're not nonprofit or profit, because we want to be of service to other human beings. That's not different. It's just a matter of how I serve. You talk about the approach and the methodology. I agree with you. How do I serve? I go in and see if I can find a place that I can contribute, and then I work hard to work collaboratively with people so that we can come to a resolution. I don't believe in transactional relationships. I believe in having conversations and developing meaningful relationships. And that's part of what we thought we would talk about today. But I think the other thing is that diverse points of view is really important to me. So that's the reason I do so much diversity work. Because if people, I've said it before, so I'm not going to repeat what I've said. And I think the reason that social justice is my higher order value, even though the others are very important to me and I live them every day, is I want to walk away from each interaction believing that people know that I care about them. I truly want to understand them. And I would appreciate it if they would understand me. And then we can emotionally connect to the point where we can get over all the backbiting and all kinds of blaming and all kinds of, arguments and everything. It is pointless. And I don't think it's just our age, because I happen to be 82 years young and you're younger than I am. So I think it's a matter of us saying, this is ridiculous. Let's start talking and see what we can suggest or what can we offer. And I think we're trying to do that in many of the organizations that we belong to. So I would like for us to go to that last thing we were going to talk about, and that is, how do we how do we set it up? We've talked about a lot of things we do, but what are the core things that we do that drive our conversations so that we have developed a very meaningful friendship?
I'll throw an answer out there, and I'm going to build on a couple of comments that you made earlier. We could say, and I do, I'm old, because the rest of the world sees me as being an old person, right? Now, frankly, I'm going to take that and say what I've got is a lot of experience, and it's varied experience, and it's experience that, often is a consequence of my own bad behavior, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm going to paraphrase Winston Churchill, but poorly. I don't mind learning, but I sure don't like being taught. So now I'm also going to say it's a piece of a value statement, which is when I think of board service or industry service or service to society, it's less about my making a point. And there's a lot of people, that's their existence, right? They want to make a point. They want to make a point in the boardroom. They want to make a point in a sales pitch. They're less interested in solving a problem than just being correct. And that's pretty tiring. One, if you are that kind of person, I think it's exhaustive. And secondly, if you're the person who's being exposed to that individual, that's very difficult. So, your comment about when you serve on a board, it is about finding a place where you can make a difference. It's not about going in there and just saying everything is wrong, I'm here to fix it. And I learned that pretty early. I mean, like very, very early in my professional career, probably like within the first 60 days. And the nature of people is that they will walk in and their culture or their experience or something drives them just to say, I want to turn this to exactly what it used to look like in my previous life when I was at this other company, right? I'm here to fix this. That's not constructive. That's really counterproductive. So if you go in and you try to understand and think of what do I bring if I'm going to serve on a board, what's the thing that I bring? From my own point of view, it's a good understanding, in fact, a very good understanding of enterprise risk management, particularly on the marketing, business development, and technology side of it. And if I think about boards today, and this is one of the things that we talk about, right? We're operating, having a conversation at a higher level, which is how do we identify a problem? Do we think this problem? How do we identify it? Can we linearize it, or how does anybody go about solving it, right? So if I use that parallel, say on the board, the diversity that I want, I'm going to try and bring a bunch of threads together here, right? At the board level, I want a bunch of people with different sets of experience, and I want expert generalists. If I'm on a board and 50% of my revenue is associated with human beings dealing with other human beings, I better have a really good understanding of the risk associated with human capital, retention, development, et cetera. If 80% of my revenue is associated with a piece of mythical technology that doesn't even, you can't even see it physically, right? Let's call that AI, as we hear a lot about today. I think my board and my management need to have a really deep understanding of the risks and the opportunities, and not just be good financial people. I want somebody who truly understands, wow, if something goes wrong, what's the risk financially, to reputation, et cetera, et cetera. So where I was going with that is I want that diversity. Now, I guess I've been around long enough that I recognize and I know that I need that. It's less about having an authority tell me that I need it. Now, on the, I'm going to weave some DEI in here because I think it's important. On the inclusion side, at the board level or management level, if these people are working for the company, or if they're engaged in this enterprise at whatever level, then, for goodness sake, let's not just bullshit ourselves. They're there because they add value, and they need to be heard. They need to be included. And that's another thing, one, bang, that's experience that says, I need a lot of clever people, right? On the equity side of it, it's less about guaranteeing an outcome than it is guaranteeing the opportunity. You're here, here's the opportunity. Your own values and your own skills and your talent, et cetera, have got to be brought to bear here so that you're generating value for the enterprise. Now, here's where I'll try and weave this together, right? The bulk of my career has been in the energy services space. I'm an oil field service hand. And if I look around the world at the people that I've worked with, there's been language barriers, cultural barriers, a dislike of skin color, any number of things, right? But a former CEO of mine said, well, everybody who's on the rig has got something that they need to do, and they need to be able to do it very well. It's got to be somebody who waters the camels, whatever the case may be. And it's only because we, as a group of people on that rig, and the marine environments and military environments, the same parallels exist. Aviation. I have to be able to trust the people because I can't do this all myself, right? So
Right.
inherently, that diversity of thought, opinion, skill, talent, etc. The inclusion, because their voice has to be heard. The flight attendant who's trying to get everybody out of the airplane is every bit as important as the pilot who's trying to land the plane successfully, right? And I don't know if those are good parallels or analogs, but we can work toward that level, right? And I think the discussions you and I have are at a higher enough level where we're not trying to solve a political issue here. We're trying to think of what do you do that improves the performance of a company, that makes people want to work for it, that makes people want to buy the goods or services it produces, that enables the company to survive whatever political, geopolitical, mechanical technology, financial stresses it's about to experience. So, we operate at a different level, and I think our conversations are different. Now, that sounds egotistical, and that's not the intent, but I think if you can have those conversations and you stay away from the ranting and raving on the polarization, then they're productive. And you exercise your critical thinking skills, try and understand the value that somebody else's point of view, perspective, and experience brings. And that's where I've had success in business and whatever it is that I've done. And I know people who've been in similar environments, but they haven't learned those same lessons, if you will. And it could be where they've been in industry. There's rednecks everywhere. And there are people who are, I'm going to say, ignorant, not stupid. They may have very high IQs, but they're just, they're ignorant. They're not interested in somebody else's point of view. I think it's important to understand. I think it's important to benefit from the experiences. I think it's important to collaborate. And to me, this is that very thing that we talk of, continuous improvement. So let's find out what we need to fix. Let's understand who's got the talent, the resources, bring it together, and then we should be successful.
Right. And not have it dominated by one person or two people, but have it a really respectful process that realizes what people really need and what they want and what will allow them to reach their highest potential. I think you have summarized every thought I've ever had in my life about social justice. You define social justice in your own words, because that's what I see as social justice. So I'm going to say something to you. I think we need to have further conversations because I think our listeners are going to really appreciate what we've said today. We'll see, but I'm going to ask them to at least give us some reviews, because I think that we have done a heck of a job of showing what can happen when you calm down and listen and then give your points of view. So I can't thank you enough, Nigel, to be on Hot Topic Bold Talk. And I think we need to talk about other topics that we can include on the podcast. So I thank you.
I thank you for the time, for the invitation. And I think there's always stuff to talk about. And the elegance, if you will, is going to be finding a way to have a conversation and not an argument. So that's right what I would aspire to. Yes.
Thank you. Hello, this is Dr. Jackalyn. I just want to talk about Nigel and give you a lot more information about him, because I think he's a phenomenal person and a great friend of mine. I think what you heard between us was something that needs to be done more often in America. We do have different points of view. He's more conservative than I am, and I'm more liberal than he is on many things. But we have come to the place where we both know that we're innovative when we really believe something needs to be resolved. And we're going to find the best way to discuss it to see if we can come up with some better suggestions or options or solutions. And that's who he is. You've heard on this podcast about him having 3 passports. From Great Britain, from Canada, and also the United States. He is an immigrant to our country. Now, as he says, he came in legitimately and through a system. I think the things I want you to know about him as a business person is he was in C-suite offices in public and private companies for over 45 years. He's still working and still consulting and doing all kinds of things with businesses. And I think the thing that I greatly appreciate about him is he has a deep respect for culture and history and people, period. He's developed a startup company that's developing AI and ML solutions for the oil fields. I think he's authentic, and you've seen it in all of his responses. And I think you see us really caring about each other, being respectful of each other, listening, and really paying attention. And that's the reason I'm growing. He's growing, and we're having greater understandings as we talk. I hope you will hear us all the way through and hear these comments from me and listen to it again. So hopefully you can do the same thing with people that have a different point of view from you. Thank you.